Germany's heavy tanks have become some of the most celebrated weapons of the Second World War, symbols of firepower and engineering ambition. But the war Germany was fighting by 1943 was no longer decided by individual machines. While the Tigers and Panthers captured attention, Germany was building another armored vehicle in even greater numbers, the Sturmgeschütz, or assault gun. Smaller, simpler, and faster to manufacture, it became one of the backbone vehicles of Germany's defensive war. By the end of the conflict, StuGs had achieved more armored kills than Tigers and Panthers combined, underscoring just how effective the vehicle truly was. So, the question is worth asking. What if Germany had focused less on heavy panzers and more on mass-producing StuGs instead? What would that choice have meant in a war increasingly shaped by scale rather than spectacle? To answer that, we have to step back from the mythology of German armor and look at the reality Germany faced after the first years of the war. Because by 1942, the conflict had become something very different from the fast campaigns of 1939 and 1940. On the Eastern Front especially, Germany was drawn into a grinding war of attrition where losses were constant, front lines were enormous, and the demand for armored vehicles was far greater than what German industry could comfortably provide. In that environment, the question facing German planners was no longer simply which tank was the most powerful on paper. It was which armored vehicle could actually be produced in sufficient numbers, delivered to the front, maintained under harsh conditions, and replaced quickly enough to matter. And it was under those pressures that the StuG began to move from the margins of German doctrine to the center of German reality. First, we need to be clear about what a StuG actually was, because it did not start as a tank, and it was never designed to be a prestige weapon. The Sturmgeschütz, or assault gun, began as an infantry support vehicle created to accompany foot soldiers and deliver direct fire against bunkers, strongpoints, and field fortifications. It carried a gun in a fixed superstructure rather than a turret. That decision shaped everything about its identity. Without a turret, the vehicle was lower, simpler, and generally faster and cheaper to manufacture than a turreted tank built to the same era and standard. It was also harder to spot in the field, because a low silhouette is a form of protection all its own. The original idea was straightforward. Infantry assaults often stalled against fortified positions, and towing guns forward under fire was slow and costly. The StuG was meant to solve that problem by putting artillery-like firepower on tracks, protected enough to work close to the infantry line. Early on, that is how it was used. But the Eastern Front did not reward tidy separations between infantry support and tank warfare. It forced everything into the same harsh arena. As Soviet armored forces grew in number, German units found themselves facing enemy tanks far more often and in far greater mass than planners had expected. At the same time, German tank strength was never evenly distributed. Panzer divisions could not be everywhere at once, and after major offensives, or major defeats, they were often under strength. Infantry divisions holding long sectors needed mobile firepower simply to survive the next breakthrough attempt. That is where the StuG story changed. The StuG was adapted, rearmed, and increasingly trained for anti-tank combat. Not because it was the perfect tank killer by design, but because it was available, it was mobile, and it could mount a serious gun. Over time, this vehicle that began as an infantry support system became one of Germany's most widely fielded armored platforms, and in defensive fighting it became, in practice, a crucial anti-tank weapon. Now we have to look at the industrial logic, because this what-if question rises or falls on production reality. Heavy tanks like the Tiger and Panther offered formidable battlefield capabilities, but they also demanded a level of industrial effort that Germany struggled to sustain as the war progressed. These vehicles were complex. They required high-quality materials, precision machining, extensive assembly time, and long test and repair cycles before reaching combat units in good order. Even when they performed well, heavy tanks carried a second layer of cost, the burden of keeping them running. They required more spare parts, specialized maintenance recovery vehicles, trained mechanics, and increasingly scarce fuel. A heavy tank that was immobilized by mechanical failure was not simply out of the fight. It became a logistics problem, a recovery problem, and, often under enemy pressure, a permanent loss. The StuG sat on the other side of that trade-off. It was not cheap in an absolute sense, and it was not easy, but it was generally simpler than a turreted tank of comparable era, and it could be produced in larger numbers within the same strained system. In total, roughly 10,000 StuG-3s of various types were produced during the war, making it the most produced German fully tracked armored fighting vehicle, and one of the most common German armored combat vehicles overall. That scale alone tells you something important. The StuG was not a niche vehicle that accidentally appeared. It was an industrial answer to a strategic problem. This matters because by 1943 and 1944, the war was increasingly decided by replacement rates. It did not matter how impressive an armored vehicle was in isolation if it could not be delivered in sufficient quantity and maintained in the field long enough to influence operations. This is why the StuG becomes central to the question. Germany's armored war, as it evolved, split into two competing impulses. One impulse aimed at battlefield superiority through elite, technically ambitious machines. The other aimed at battlefield coverage through vehicles that could be built, issued, and replaced faster. Both impulses were present at the same time, and both consumed the same pool of labor, materials, transport capacity, and fuel. Then we have to ground this in battlefield reality, because production numbers only matter if we understand what German forces needed armored vehicles to do. A useful place to examine this is the summer of 1943, during the fighting around Kursk, because it reveals the shape of Germany's mid-war problem. Kursk is often remembered as a contest of armored strength and tank design, but it was equally a contest of endurance, maintenance organization, and the ability to keep vehicles operational in a battle that did not end quickly. The German attacking force concentrated a massive share of its armored strength for the offensive, reaching roughly around 2,500 tanks and assault guns gathered for the operation, a figure that itself shows how Germany treated assault guns as part of its armored striking power, not merely as background infantry support. Even within famous formations, assault guns were present in meaningful numbers. In the southern sector, for example, accounts of the SS Panzer Grenadier divisions list a force that included dozens of assault guns alongside their tanks. The striking detail is not that there were assault guns, but that heavy tanks were comparatively few within that mix, because the war was already imposing limits on what could be concentrated and sustained. Kursk also illustrates the risk built into the heavy tank approach. The Panther, for all its promise, was rushed into combat at Kursk with unresolved technical problems. Mechanical issues caused significant losses and reduced operational availability. This matters for our question because it highlights a broader point. In a war of attrition, combat power is not only firepower and armor. It is also readiness, reliability, and the ability to keep vehicles running across days of movement, dust, heat, mud, and constant repair pressure. When the battlefield is saturated with mines, artillery, anti-tank guns, and constant counterattacks, raw armor thickness and gun caliber are only part of the story. The other part is whether a unit can keep enough vehicles running to remain coherent. In that context, a vehicle's value includes reliability and maintainability, not just lethality. This is one of the reasons StuGs could matter so much in defensive operations. A StuG unit, positioned properly, did not need to maneuver like a turreted tank to be dangerous. It needed to cover likely routes of approach, hold a kill zone, and cooperate with infantry, anti-tank guns, and artillery. The vehicle's low silhouette made concealment easier, and its fixed gun, when aligned with prepared positions, supported deliberate, accurate fire. Now, none of this means the StuG was a wonder solution. It had real limitations that shaped how it could be used. Without a turret, the StuG was less flexible in fast-moving engagements where threats appeared from multiple directions, or at close range in urban combat, where danger came from side streets, upper floors, and sudden flanking shots. Turreted tanks offered better all-round responsiveness. In chaotic close-quarter fighting, a fixed gun could become a liability if the vehicle was forced to rotate its entire hull to track targets, especially under pressure. But as Germany's war increasingly became defensive after 1943, the environment often favored the StuG's strengths more than its weaknesses. German forces were less frequently conducting sweeping armored advances and more frequently reacting to Soviet offensives, stabilizing threatened sectors, and trying to hold ground long enough to regroup. In that kind of fighting, a vehicle that was easier to produce and suitable for defensive ambush tactics could be more strategically useful than a small number of heavy tanks that could not be distributed widely or replaced quickly. This leads into the real what if, and it helps to frame it in a disciplined way. If Germany had shifted resources away from heavy panzers and toward mass production of StuGs, the most immediate and plausible outcome is not a sudden transformation of German strategy, but an increase in armored density across the front. More assault guns could have meant more infantry divisions reinforced with mobile direct fire support, more local anti-tank reserves available to commanders, and a greater ability to improvise defensive lines when panzer divisions were absent or under strength. Now, we should look at how Germany actually organized assault gun forces as the war went on, because organization reveals intent. By 1944, dedicated StuG units were being reorganized and redesignated into brigades with multiple batteries and a fairly standardized structure. This reflected the fact that these were not ad hoc attachments, but a recognized component of Germany's defensive toolkit. That organizational shift matters because it shows the army formalizing assault gun employment during a period when Germany's overall situation demanded quicker, more reliable ways to put armored firepower into threatened sectors. By 1944, this question becomes sharper, because 1944 is the year when constraints dominate everything. The Eastern Front witnessed enormous Soviet offensives that shattered German army groups and forced constant emergency responses. While in the West, Germany faced the opening of a second major front. Even if you had the best heavy tanks in the world, you still had to distribute them across multiple crises, keep them fueled, and keep them repaired, all while losing workshops, rail lines, and experienced crews. And here is where the StuG's industrial story becomes a lens into Germany's wider problems. StuG production itself was affected by bombing and disruption, including significant drops connected to attacks on key production facilities. Germany responded with substitutions and changes, including introducing the StuG 4 on a different chassis as part of the effort to keep assault gun output flowing. In other words, even the practical solution was still constrained by the same war economy pressures that were crushing everything else. When repair systems are overstretched and transport networks are under pressure, a vehicle that can be produced and fielded in greater quantity becomes valuable, even if it is not ideal for every tactical environment. However, we should also acknowledge the limits that a StuG-heavy strategy would face, because a neutral analysis cannot imply that more StuGs automatically equals meaningful strategic change. StuGs still required fuel, ammunition, trained crews, maintenance, and secure routes to bring all of that to the front. Germany's fuel shortages worsened as the war progressed, and fuel limitations affected training, mobility, and the ability to conduct counterattacks. A larger number of StuGs would not fix the basic fuel arithmetic of a nation fighting on multiple fronts under increasing pressure. Nor would a StuG focus solve the problem of air superiority. Allied and Soviet air power increasingly threatened German movement in daylight, disrupted supplies, and punished concentrations of vehicles. Armored units could not simply appear where needed without risk, and the ability to shift reserves rapidly was increasingly constrained. A StuG might be cheaper than a heavy tank, but it still had to reach the battlefield. And by 1944, reaching the battlefield intact was becoming harder. Then we need to address what heavy tanks actually provided, because heavy panzers were not simply wasteful vanity projects. Their advantages were real. A heavy tank's armor could offer better survivability in direct engagements, and its turret allowed quicker response to threats that appeared suddenly from new angles. In certain tactical situations, especially when used by trained crews with infantry and artillery support, heavy tanks could produce disproportionate results relative to their numbers. There was also a psychological and operational dimension. The presence of heavy tanks influenced enemy behavior and planning. It could slow advances, force caution, or shape the timing of attacks. Those effects are hard to quantify, but they were part of why commanders continued to value heavy armor even as the costs mounted. The problem was not that heavy tanks were useless. The problem was scale and sustainability. Heavy tanks could dominate local engagements, but they could not be produced or maintained in enough quantity to shape the overall trajectory of the war once Germany was outmatched industrially. As the war moved into its later years, Germany's ability to maximize the value of these heavy tanks was steadily eroded by shortages, bombing, declining training time, and the relentless tempo of defensive crises. So when we return to the central question, what if Germany had built far more StuGs and fewer heavy tanks? The most responsible answer is that it would have produced a different texture of German armored warfare, rather than a different outcome. A larger StuG-focused force could have improved Germany's ability to absorb attrition in the short term by providing more usable armored vehicles, more widely distributed across infantry formations. It could have strengthened local anti-tank defenses, reduced the frequency of sectors being held with minimal mobile support, and provided commanders with more predictable armored reserves for emergency response. It might also have improved the coherence of defense during retreats. A greater number of assault guns could help form successive defensive lines, covering withdrawal routes and punishing overextension by attacking forces. In some sectors, this could have increased the cost of Soviet advances and improved the German ability to stabilize fronts after major shocks. But it would not have changed the factors that decided the war. StuGs could not create fuel. They could not solve manpower shortages. They could not restore air superiority. And they could not protect rail networks from attack. They could not replace the loss of experienced officers, mechanics, and crews, which steadily reduced the effectiveness of all German formations, regardless of equipment. They also could not turn a defensive posture into sustained operational initiative, because their strengths were largely aligned with defense and ambush, rather than fast, multi-directional offensive maneuver. That last point matters because Germany's strategic situation after 1943 demanded not only defense, but the ability to regain initiative through counterattacks, and turreted tanks remained valuable in offensive fluidity. Assault guns could support counterattacks, but the lack of a turret still imposed limits in dynamic operations. So the conclusion is not that Germany should have built only StuGs, or that heavy tanks were a mistake in principle. The real point is that the StuG represents the logic of industrial warfare more clearly than the heavy panzer does. It shows how, in a war of attrition, the value of a weapon system is inseparable from the ability to produce it, sustain it, and replace it. In that world, the StuG mattered because it aligned more closely with sustainability. It was not a prestige weapon, and it did not promise battlefield dominance by itself. But it could be produced at scale and issued widely, and it could be employed effectively in the kind of defensive battles Germany increasingly fought. Heavy tanks mattered because they could deliver real battlefield advantages in local engagements, sometimes decisively. But those advantages existed inside a system that was steadily losing its ability to support them, especially under the combined pressure of multiple fronts, bombing shortages, and relentless offensives. So if Germany had focused more intensely on mass-producing StuGs, the most likely outcome is not a dramatic reversal, but a more consistent distribution of armored firepower across the front, a stronger defensive toolkit for infantry divisions, and a slightly improved ability to respond to repeated crises. But the decisive limits of fuel, manpower, air power, and industrial inferiority would still have remained. In the end, the StuG story is not about one vehicle saving or failing a nation. It is about adaptation under pressure, and about what modern war demands when it becomes a contest of replacement rates as much as tactics. It is a reminder that the weapons we remember most often are the ones that look dominant in isolation, while the weapons that shape a war's daily reality are often the ones a strained economy can actually build, deliver, and replace.